Emma had always dreamed of finding peace. After years of the city's noise and chaos, she had yearned for solitude, a place to breathe, to heal, to escape. So when she stumbled upon the farmhouse tucked away in the countryside, it seemed like a perfect fit. Its charm was undeniable. The price was well within her reach, and its old stone walls and weathered wood held a quiet mystery that called to her. The locals, however, warned her against it. The house had been empty for years, they said, ever since the last family vanished without a trace. But Emma had never been one to believe in ghost stories, and she brushed off the hushed whispers and sideways glances as superstition. She needed this, a fresh start. And so, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, she moved in. The farmhouse sat on the edge of a sprawling field, surrounded by a dense, silent forest. The first night was uneventful, the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the rain drummed against the roof. But inside, it was quiet. Emma found solace in the rhythm of the storm, the constant hum of nature surrounding her. Yet, as she wandered the rooms the next morning, something unsettled her. It wasn't the house itself, but rather the stillness. The air felt thick, as if the house was waiting. The walls of the living room were adorned with faded portraits of strangers, people who had once lived here, loved here, maybe even died here. Each picture seemed to stare back at her, their painted eyes full of stories she couldn't hear but somehow felt. She moved past them quickly, trying not to let her imagination run wild. But something about them lingered in her mind. The farmhouse had no electricity, only the dim light of the windows during the day and the soft glow of candles at night. The kitchen was old but functional. As she unpacked, Emma couldn't help but notice the odd silence that filled the house, a silence so complete it felt as if the world beyond it had disappeared. She laughed at herself for feeling uneasy. There was nothing here but the wind and the trees, and yet there was a weight to the quiet that pressed on her chest. That night, after a solitary meal, she decided to explore the house. The air outside had cooled, and a low mist rolled over the fields, creeping toward the house like an uninvited guest. Emma made her way to the staircase, its wooden steps creaking beneath her as she ascended to the second floor. The hallway stretched long and narrow, darkened by the lack of light. The shadows clung to the walls, twisting and warping as the wind howled outside. She opened the first door. She came to a small bedroom. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by the slight movement of her breath. The room was sparse, a bed with threadbare linens, a rocking chair that stood still, its wooden arms chipped and worn. There was an odd sensation about it, as though the room had been left undisturbed for far too long. She set her things down on the bed and walked to the window, pulling the faded curtains aside. Outside, the mist had thickened, and she could barely make out the shape of the barn. In the distance, its dark silhouette, a faint shadow against the gray sky. As her eyes lingered on the barn, she thought she saw a figure move in the doorway. The faintest flicker of movement, too quick to make out clearly. Her heart skipped, and she turned quickly to leave the room, dismissing the thought as a trick of the light. But when she stepped back into the hallway, something else caught her eye. At the far end of the hall, a door stood ajar. The faintest glow emanated from within, as if there was light hidden behind it, something pulsing and breathing in the darkness. Curiosity tugged at her, and despite the unease curling in her stomach, she walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier, as though the house was drawing her closer, urging her forward. When she reached the door, she hesitated before pushing it open. The room inside was smaller than the others, cramped and dimly lit by the soft light that seemed to come from nowhere. It was the smell that hit her first, damp and musty like the earth after rain. But there was something else, something sharp beneath the decay. She stepped further inside her heart, hammering in her chest. A large cracked mirror hung on the wall, and beneath it was an old wooden chest, its surface marred by deep scratches, as though something or someone had tried to break into it. Her eyes moved to the corners of the room, drawn to a figure standing there in the shadows. It was faint, like a smear of darkness against the wall, but it was unmistakable. A figure tall and thin, its arms stretched out unnaturally wide. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel her breath quicken. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, its hollow eyes fixed on her, its face obscured by the shadows. Her legs were frozen, her body unable to move. And then, the air thickened, the pressure building until it felt as if the room itself was closing in on her. The figure didn't speak, but she could hear it, feel it in the pit of her stomach, a voice low and distorted, like a whisper that echoed in her mind. Leave. The command was not spoken aloud, but it rang through her like a bell. She stumbled backward, her feet unsteady beneath her, and as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her. She jumped, the sound echoing through the house, but the hallway was empty. The room was empty. Emma stood there breathless, her body trembling, unsure if what she had just seen had been real. She could hear the wind outside, the storm still raging, but in the distance, something else stirred. Something old, something that had never left. The whispers continued. Emma stumbled back toward the staircase, her mind racing. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself was trying to hold her in place. The weight of what had just happened, what she had seen, pressed down on her, suffocating her with its silence. The house had been still, so still, but now it was alive with something else, something darker. She couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for her, and that whatever she had just encountered in that room was only the beginning. She didn't stop until she reached the bottom of the stairs, her breath ragged and shallow. The living room lay before her, the dim light from the few candles flickering and casting long shadows on the walls. The house felt colder now, a biting chill that made her skin prickle with unease. She looked toward the window where the mist had thickened, and the faint outline of the barn seemed even more sinister in the growing darkness. The whispers were gone, but their presence remained. They hadn't spoken to her directly, but the air seemed to hum with their residue. The voice in her mind, soft yet commanding. Leave? Was it a warning, a plea, or something else entirely? Emma's thoughts circled like a storm, each one pulling her in different directions. She had to leave. That much was clear. The farmhouse, the land, it was not hers. It never had been. There was something about it that didn't want her here, something old and forgotten that had been disturbed by her presence. And yet, despite the terror that gripped her, despite the overwhelming sense of danger, she couldn't bring herself to go. Not yet. She turned toward the back door, the only way out, but as her hand touched the doorknob, a sudden crashing sound made her freeze. It came from upstairs, from the room she had just left. The door she had closed. A thump followed by the unmistakable sound of scraping. A heavy dragging noise as though something was being moved. Something large, something heavy. Her body tensed, every muscle in her limbs screaming to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned away from the door, her eyes glued to the stairs. The sound continued slow and deliberate. Scrape, thump, scrape, thump, like something or someone was making its way down toward her. She stood there paralyzed, her breath shallow. The house was alive, and it was moving. The thing upstairs, whatever it was coming for her. The thumping grew louder, closer until she could hear it right above her head. She backed away slowly, her mind trying to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't possible. The house was empty. It had been empty for years. But the noise there was no denying it now. It was real. Without thinking, Emma grabbed the nearest thing she could find, an old metal candlestick, and held it in front of her like a shield. Her hands shook, but she gripped it tightly, ready to defend herself from whatever was coming down those stairs. And then the noise stopped. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. It filled the room, pressing against her ears until she could hear nothing but her own heartbeat. The thumping was gone. The scraping was gone. It was as if the house itself had swallowed the sound, as if it had never existed at all. But Emma didn't dare lower the candlestick. Her eyes remained fixed on the staircase, her mind racing with thoughts of what might be lurking just out of sight. Something had been in that room. Something had been moving. And now it was waiting. She waited. The minutes stretched into eternity, the stillness suffocating. It was too quiet. The house felt as if it was holding its breath, waiting for her to make a move, for her to do something, anything that would break the silence. And then from the darkness of the stairs came a soft creak. Emma gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. The figure was there again, standing just at the top of the stairs, its form barely visible in the shadows. It was the same shape, the same tall, gaunt figure, only this time its eyes were open. Hollow, black, empty, and as it stepped down the stairs, it did not walk. It glided. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, bending in ways they should not. Emma couldn't move. Her legs were frozen, her feet glued to the floor. The figure's face twisted and warped, as if it were made of smoke and shadows, its features constantly shifting, never staying the same. The low hum of its presence filled the room, and Emma felt it deep in her chest, a vibration that rattled her very bones. It reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped just a few feet away from her. Its hollow eyes never left her face, and the air grew colder still, the temperature dropping rapidly, until Emma could see her own breath in front of her. It reached out one elongated hand, fingers long and twisted, and as it did, the shadows in the room seemed to grow, stretching, reaching, pulling toward her. "Leave," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more forceful, as if the house itself was speaking through the figure. Her body screamed at her to run, to turn and flee, but the weight of its presence, the sheer force of the darkness pressing in on her, made it impossible. She was frozen. She was trapped. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room fell silent. The shadows receded, and the temperature began to return to normal. Emma stood there panting, her body shaking violently, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Had it been real? Was she losing her mind? But deep down, she knew. She knew the truth. The house was alive, and it would never let her go. In the distance, the wind howled once more, and Emma realized that she was not alone. Not anymore. Story 2. The Farm That Never Sleeps. It was the quiet that unsettled Daniel most. He had expected the country to be peaceful, but this was something else. The silence seemed unnatural, as if the world around him had been muted, hushed into stillness by something he couldn't see. The farmhouse he had inherited from his late uncle, a remote piece of land tucked away in the hills, was supposed to be a fresh start. The air was cleaner here, the sky clearer, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of city life lift from his shoulders. But there was something about the farm that gnawed at him, a sense that the house itself was waiting. When Daniel first arrived, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The old farmhouse had a charm to it. Its faded red paint, the overgrown vines, climbing the sides, and the barn at the back with its weathered doors that creaked open under the weight of time. It wasn't large, but it was more than enough for him. His uncle had lived alone here for years, and when Daniel had inherited it, he thought it would be the ideal place to escape from the hustle and bustle. He thought he would work the land, perhaps restore the house a little, and start a new life. The first day was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no animals to tend to, no neighbors to speak of, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call in the distance. The farm stretched out before him, fields of tall grass that swayed in the breeze, the barn at the far edge, and the empty house standing like a monument to days gone by. The first night came without much incident, save for the creaking of the house settling and the occasional rustle outside that he attributed to small animals. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The quiet deepened, becoming a presence of its own, as though the very air was holding its breath. Daniel thought he heard a faint whispering from somewhere deep within the house, but when he checked, the rooms were empty. The second day, a strange chill settled in the air. It wasn't the kind of cold one might expect from a farm at night, but a lingering, oppressive cold that seemed to seep through the walls. He tried to ignore it, busying himself with unpacking and making repairs, but the house always seemed colder when he wasn't actively engaged in something. It crept up on him during moments of stillness, when the silence of the farm had become too thick, too suffocating. In the evening, when Daniel was sitting down to dinner, the lights flickered. At first he thought it was just the old wiring, but then the bulbs seemed to pulse, dimming and brightening in a slow, rhythmic pattern. It was subtle but unmistakable. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his nerves. But as the night wore on, the house began to feel more like a living thing, watching him with a presence that seemed to grow heavier the longer he stayed. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house settling seemed amplified, as though the house was trying to speak, but in a language that was beyond his understanding. The nights grew longer, and Daniel began to sense that he was not truly alone. He felt eyes on him even when the house was empty, a vague, unsettling sensation that something was always just out of sight. At first he attributed it to his imagination. After all, he was in a new place, a solitary place where his mind could easily wander. But the feeling didn't go away. It was there when he lay in bed. It followed him through the house when he went to check on the old furnace. And even when he stepped outside into the crisp, cool air of the evening, it lingered like a shadow at the edge of his vision. He decided to explore the barn the next morning, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had gripped him since he arrived. The barn was dark, its interior filled with the smell of old wood and dust. It seemed to be in better condition than he had expected, the roof intact and the wooden beams sturdy enough to hold up the weight of whatever was left inside. He moved through the rows of old equipment and unused farming tools, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. As he moved deeper into the barn, Daniel noticed something strange. The air was colder here than it had been in the house, and there was a palpable sense of heaviness that hung in the air. He ran his hand along the side of a rusted tractor, and as he did, something caught his eye. An old weathered chair sitting in the corner just behind a stack of old hay bales. It was a simple wooden chair, its surface worn from years of use, but there was something about it that felt out of place. Daniel walked toward it, and as he did, a strange feeling washed over him, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. The closer he got to the chair, the more oppressive the air became, until it felt as though the barn itself was closing in on him. He reached out and touched the chair, his fingers brushing against its rough surface. In that moment, he could have sworn he felt something shift in the air, something subtle but unmistakable, like a sigh of relief. He pulled his hand away, quickly, his heart racing, and stepped back. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above, startling him. He looked up, heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing. The rafters of the barn were empty, just the wooden beams stretching up into the shadows. He stood there for a moment waiting, but the barn was still once again. The unease that had been gnawing at him flared up into full-blown dread. Something was wrong here. Something was very wrong. As he turned to leave the barn, he thought he heard something else, something faint, coming from the dark recesses of the building. It sounded like a whisper, but not in any language he could understand. He froze. The barn, the land, the house, it was all part of something ancient, something that had never truly been abandoned. And now that he was here, it seemed that the house would not let him leave. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees. But inside the barn, it was deathly still. The whispering continued, growing louder now, as if whatever had been waiting all this time was finally revealing itself. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, the chill in the barn biting into his skin as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was as though the very air around him had come alive with a voice that was old, ancient, even murmuring things he couldn't comprehend. His heart raced in his chest, his mind screaming at him to run, to flee this place. But his feet remained frozen, his body gripped by a paralyzing fear that made movement impossible. The shadows in the barn seemed to stretch and bend as though they were alive, curling around the beams like tendrils wrapping themselves around the walls and ceiling. Daniel's eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for the source of the sound, but the barn was empty, save for the old tools and forgotten relics of a time long past. The whispers persisted, growing louder, and yet still he could see nothing. It was as if the barn itself was breathing, the very structure of the building vibrating with the unseen force that had been waiting all these years. Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature plummeted, and Daniel's breath became visible in front of him like smoke rising from his lips. A deep guttural groan emanated from the far corner of the barn, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. It was slow, deliberate, as though the weight of whatever was moving was immense, and Daniel instinctively took a step back, his pulse quickening in his ears. In the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow larger than any of the others moving across the floor toward him. His gaze snapped toward it, and for a fleeting moment, he could have sworn he saw the shape of a man, tall, gaunt, with long skeletal limbs. But before he could fully process it, the shadow vanished, dissipating into the darkness, leaving him alone with his racing thoughts. He turned quickly, his mind now racing with possibilities. Was it just the barn playing tricks on him? Could it be his imagination, fueled by the loneliness of the farm and the strange whispers he had heard since his arrival? Or was there something else here, something darker, something that had been buried beneath the floorboards and hidden in the walls? The whispering came again, louder now, and Daniel instinctively covered his ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It was like the voices were inside his head, swirling around him, filling the very air. "Leave," they whispered. "Leave this place." His legs trembled beneath him, and he knew then that he couldn't stay. He had to leave. The house, the barn, the land. They weren't just empty. They was alive with something that would never let him go. He turned toward the door, his hands trembling as he gripped the handle. But as he pulled it open, the wind outside seemed to howl even louder, as though something was holding the door shut from the other side. He struggled with it, panic rising in his chest, until finally the door gave way with a groan and he stumbled out into the yard. But the whispering didn't stop. It followed him, a distant hum that seemed to echo in the corners of his mind. He looked back at the farmhouse, its dark windows staring back at him like hollow eyes. The barn loomed behind him, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting him to return. The land stretched out before him, empty and barren, yet somehow filled with an unspoken presence. Daniel had to get away. He had to leave the farm and never come back. He didn't know how long he had been standing there, staring at the house, but the sun was starting to dip beneath the horizon, casting the land in a muted twilight glow. It was then that he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the field, far off in the distance. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a shadow cast by the trees. But as his eyes focused, he realized it was a person. A tall, thin figure standing motionless, watching him. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching him, its features obscured by the dimming light. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest. The whispering in his mind grew louder, more urgent, and he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't a person. It was something else. Something far older than anything he could comprehend. The figure remained still, and for a moment, Daniel couldn't bring himself to look away. It felt as though time had stopped, as if everything in the world had come to a halt. And the only thing that existed in that moment was the figure standing in the field, and him staring at it. Then in an instant, it vanished. The figure, the presence, the sense of being watched, it all disappeared, as if it had never been there. But the feeling of dread didn't lift. If anything, It deepened like a weight pressing on his chest. He spun on his heels, running toward the house, desperate to leave the land behind. But the house seemed to stretch further away the more he ran, its silhouette growing darker, more foreboding, as if it were pulling him back. His legs burned as he pushed forward, each step feeling like it took more effort than the last. When he reached the door, it swung open before he even touched it, as though the house itself were inviting him back inside. He didn't think. He just ran, collapsing onto the old couch in the living room, gasping for breath. The silence returned thicker than before. The house was still, but the weight of its presence pressed on him. The knowledge that something had been watching, waiting for him to cross the threshold. He could hear the whispering again, distant but clear. "Stay." And as he closed his eyes, he realized the truth. The farm never slept, and neither would he. Story 3. The Disappearing Farmers. The Miller family had been farming the land for generations. Their homestead, nestled between stretches of dense forest and rolling hills, was an isolated spot that few ever visited. The house was old, the kind of place that seemed to lean into the earth as though it had been there so long it had become part of the landscape. Despite its age, the farm was well kept, straight rows of crops in the fields, the barn in decent repair, and animals that were tended to with care. But then one day they disappeared. No one could explain it. The Millers had always been quiet people, but they weren't reclusive. They had neighbors, even though they were a bit distant, and the occasional visitor to the farm for trade or news. The strange thing was no one noticed when they vanished, not immediately anyway. The house stood empty, just like it always had, the farm continuing on as if nothing had changed. The animals were gone, the crops left to wither, but the house remained standing. The barn door still swinging in the wind, the shutters creaking in the breeze. For weeks, no one asked questions. The quiet nature of the family had always made them somewhat distant from the community, so their sudden absence wasn't so alarming at first. But when the crops had begun to die and the animals went unfed for longer than anyone could ignore, the people in the nearby village started to wonder. It wasn't until a neighbor, Martha Green, had gone to visit the farm herself to check on the Millers that anyone thought something might be wrong. Martha was the first to arrive at the doorstep. When no one answered, she ventured inside, thinking perhaps the family was out tending the fields. But inside, the house was unnervingly still. Dust had begun to settle on the furniture. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the windows, and the air was thick with the scent of stale, unused space. There was no sign of the family, no sign of anything that might have suggested they had left willingly. She walked through the house, her boots creaking on the wooden floors. The kitchen, once warm and inviting, was now cold and empty. A pot sat on the stove, its contents long since gone cold, but the most disturbing thing was the table. A half-finished meal still set out, as though the family had just stepped away from it. Plates with uneaten food mugs, half filled with coffee, and a stack of bread on the counter, everything in perfect disarray, as though they had been interrupted by something. Something unexpected. Martha didn't know what to make of it. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows or doors. It was as if the family had simply disappeared. She turned back toward the door, but something stopped her. It was faint at first, like a whisper, a soft hum in the air. Martha paused her breath, catching in her throat. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. Something in the house was watching her, waiting. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. But there was nothing. No one. Just the quiet. The eerie, empty quiet that seemed to settle over her like a thick fog. The whisper came again, louder this time. It was coming from upstairs. Martha moved toward the stairs, her feet heavy with dread, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to see it for herself, had to understand what had happened to the Millers. She ascended slowly, each step creaking beneath her, the air growing colder with every move. At the top of the stairs, there was a door slightly ajar. From behind it, she could see a faint light flickering. Her hand reached out, trembling, as she pushed the door open. The room inside was unlike any she had seen. It wasn't dusty or forgotten like the rest of the house. In fact, it seemed almost pristine. The bed was made, the floor swept, the curtains drawn back just enough to let the dim light in. But what caught her attention was the strange shimmering glow that seemed to pulse in the center of the room. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. But as she stepped closer, she saw it more clearly, a pale mist swirling in the center of the room, floating just above the floor. It seemed alive, moving in a way that no fog or vapor should. The longer she stared at it, the more unsettling it became. And then the whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. "Leave." The voice was faint but unmistakable, echoing in her mind, urging her to retreat. It was like a command, one that she could not ignore. But she couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the spot. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her body refused. The mist swirled again, this time more violently. Martha stepped back, but as she did, something shifted in the room. She felt it, an oppressive weight, a pressure that squeezed the air from her lungs. The room seemed to grow colder, the walls pressing in on her. With a final desperate lurch, Martha turned and fled down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. As she ran out the door, the whispering stopped. The cold lifted. The air seemed to return to its normal state, as though nothing had ever happened. When she reached the village, she didn't speak of it at first. The Millers' disappearance was strange enough, but Martha knew something darker had taken place in that house. She could feel it in her bones. Something had taken them. But what all and why? She couldn't explain it, but she knew she wasn't the only one who had felt it, the weight in the air, the chill that sank into her skin. The village was never the same after that day. People began to avoid the road that led to the Miller farm, and the house itself stood like a watchful sentinel, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. And the whispering, it didn't stop. The wind carried it across the land, through the trees, across the fields. "Leave," it whispered over and over, as if something in the land itself were trying to protect its secret. Months passed, and the Millers' disappearance became a fading memory, relegated to hushed conversations and rumors. But for Martha, it was never that simple. The whispering hadn't stopped. She had heard it in the nights following her visit, a faint echo in the back of her mind, pulling at the edges of her sanity. The land surrounding the farm, once peaceful, now felt oppressive, as though it had taken on a life of its own, a life that was watching, waiting. Martha wasn't the only one to feel it. A new family moved into the farmhouse shortly after the Millers had vanished. The Harrisons, a young couple with 2 children, were looking for a fresh start, and the old Miller farm, though strange and isolated, seemed like a good place to begin. They were drawn to the idea of a quiet life away from the distractions of the village. The fact that the house was left standing, though abandoned, intrigued them. Perhaps they could bring it back to life. At first, the Harrisons seemed to be doing well. They cleaned the house, repaired the barn, and even began planting crops again. It was as if the farm had been waiting for them, the soil ready to be tilled once more. For a while, Martha kept her distance, watching from afar, not wanting to interfere, though her instincts told her that something was wrong. But when the Harrisons invited her over for a visit, she couldn't refuse. It had been months since she had been inside the house, and curiosity gnawed at her. The day was bright, the sun warm in the sky, as Martha walked down the familiar path to the farmhouse. The wind was unusually still and the air felt thick, like something was waiting just beyond her reach. She shook off the feeling as best she could, attributing it to her nerves. When she reached the front door, she knocked softly, a hesitant sound that felt strangely out of place. Mrs. Harrison opened the door, smiling warmly, her face bright with the promise of new beginnings. "Martha, come in. We've just finished setting up the kitchen. I'd love to show you around." Martha forced a smile, stepping inside, but the moment she crossed the threshold, something shifted. The house was no longer the same. The warmth was gone. The air had the same cold, suffocating feeling she had experienced when the Millers had disappeared. She could feel the weight of the house pressing against her, the silence deafening. The floor creaked beneath her feet, but it wasn't just the sound of an old house. It was the sound of something alive, something breathing in the walls. "I'm sorry I'm a little tired today," Martha said, her voice tight. "I think I'll sit for a moment." "Of course," Mrs. Harrison said, a bit too cheerfully. "The children are outside. Please make yourself comfortable." Martha nodded and sank into a chair near the window. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the room, but it didn't feel warm. It felt cold, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Mrs. Harrison continued to talk about her plans for the farm, but Martha couldn't focus on her words. Her eyes kept darting around the room, unable to shake the sense of wrongness that hung in the air. She looked at the door leading upstairs, where the whispering had come from all those months ago, and her heart skipped a beat. She knew what she had to do. Excusing herself politely, Martha rose to her feet and walked toward the stairs. Mrs. Harrison seemed not to notice, too absorbed in her own chatter. As Martha ascended the stairs, she could feel the temperature drop. Each step felt heavier, like she was walking into something she was not meant to understand. The upstairs was just as she remembered, but the room at the end of the hall, the one where the mist had swirled, the one where the voices had called out, was locked now. The door was solid, with no sign of the faint light that had once pulsed from within. Still, Martha felt drawn to it, as if the house was beckoning her to come closer. She reached for the doorknob, and the moment her fingers brushed the cold metal, the whispering began again. "Leave." It was faint at first, but it grew louder, with each passing second, a soft, urgent plea that seemed to rise from the very walls of the house. Martha's heart raced as she stepped back, but the door creaked open on its own, as though the house itself was inviting her in. She hesitated, but curiosity won out, and she pushed the door fully open. The room was empty just as before, but something was different. The air was thick with the same mist that had swirled in the center of the room months ago. It hung in the air, shimmering faintly, as though it were alive. There was no sound now, no whispering, only a heavy silence that seemed to press in on her from all sides. And then from the corner of the room, she saw it, a shape, a shadow moving in the mist. It was not human, but something far darker, something older. Its outline was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its presence was undeniable. The figure moved closer, and Martha could feel it like a pressure on her chest, like something was reaching out to pull her into the room. Her breath caught in her throat, her body frozen with fear. The mist swirled around her, and for a moment, she thought she saw faces within it, faces she recognized. The Millers, their eyes hollow and empty, staring at her with an expression of hopelessness. Martha turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room. The whispering returned louder than ever, now coming from all around her. "Stay." She struggled with the door, but it would not budge. Her heart pounded in her chest as the mist thickened, swirling faster, pulling her toward the center of the room. The shadow in the corner began to take shape, a tall skeletal figure with long clawed hands reaching out toward her. Martha screamed, but her voice was lost in the swirling fog, swallowed by the suffocating presence of the house. And as the mist closed in around her, she realized the truth. The Millers had never left. They had become part of the house, part of the land, just as anyone who stayed too long would. The farm didn't let go. It took it consumed, and once you were part of it, there was no escaping. And as the darkness enveloped her, Martha's last thought was clear: she too would become one of the Whispers. The house had claimed its next victim. Story 4. The Shadow in the Barn. The barn stood at the edge of the field, an old structure weathered by years of wind and rain. Its wooden beams creaked with the weight of age, the walls worn and splintered, the roof sagging slightly at one corner. For years, the small farm had been empty, left behind after the family who had once lived there packed up and disappeared without a trace. No one knew what had happened to them. There were just whispers of strange happenings, of late-night noises from the barn that no one could explain. Jake had heard the stories when he moved to the area. He didn't believe in them. People love a good ghost story, he thought, especially in a place as quiet and isolated as this. But the barn? The barn was different. Something about it seemed to draw him in even when he wasn't trying to pay attention. It was always there, a dark silhouette against the evening sky. Every time he passed by it, there was something unsettling in the air, a stillness as if the world around it held its breath. He had been living on the property for months now, working to restore the farmhouse that came with it. It wasn't much, just an old crumbling house with peeling paint and a collapsing foundation, but it was his. His retreat from the chaotic life he'd left behind. His place to finally breathe, but the barn remained, and the strange feeling it gave him never went away. Jake told himself it was just his imagination. The eerie silence, the way it seemed to watch him. These were just the effects of living alone in an old, neglected house. Nothing more. One evening, as twilight crept across the sky, Jake decided to take a look inside the barn. He had been putting it off for weeks, telling himself it wasn't necessary, but tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the way the last light of day cast long shadows across the field. Or maybe it was the way the wind had died down to a near unnatural stillness. Whatever the reason, Jake found himself walking toward the barn, drawn by something he couldn't name. The moment he reached the barn door, he paused. It was slightly ajar, the wood groaning faintly as the wind pushed against it. He reached for the handle, feeling the chill of the evening air on his skin, and pulled the door open. Inside the barn was dark. The only light came from the fading glow of the evening, filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls. Dust motes hung in the air, swirling lazily. In the dim light, the familiar scent of hay and old wood filled his nose. But there was something else too. Something faint, like damp earth, almost as if something had been buried here long ago. Jake stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The barn was empty, or so it seemed. Old farming equipment lay forgotten in the corners, covered in thick layers of dust. But as he ventured further into the barn, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. A large, dark shape in the back corner. At first, he thought it was just a pile of old hay, perhaps covered with a tarp. But as he moved closer, he saw that it wasn't. It was something else, something large and unsettling, the shape of it wrong in a way that he couldn't quite place. A shiver ran down his spine. He took another step closer, the floor creaking loudly underfoot, and that was when he saw it, a shadow deep and thick, standing still in the corner. It was not cast by anything visible. It was simply there, pooling in the corner of the barn like an ink stain on the air. His heart began to pound. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the shape of it. It wasn't the familiar jagged edges of a shadow cast by a beam or a piece of equipment. This shadow was different. It had an unnatural smoothness to it, an almost liquid quality that made his skin crawl. For a moment, Jake stood frozen, staring at it, trying to understand what he was seeing. His mind raced with possibilities, but nothing made sense. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs felt like lead. His body betrayed him, frozen in place, as the darkness seemed to shift, undulating in a slow, deliberate way. And then he heard it, a soft sound like a whisper, barely audible. It was coming from the direction of the shadow. "Get out!" The voice was low, guttural, like something that had been buried in the earth for centuries. It sent a jolt of fear through Jake, his breath catching in his throat. He stumbled back, but before he could take another step, the shadow seemed to move, shifting and stretching toward him, its edges curling in on themselves like something reaching out. The temperature in the barn dropped, the air growing thick with the sense of something watching him, waiting. Jake turned and ran. His heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted toward the door. The sound of his boots pounding against the wooden floor, drowning out everything else. He reached for the handle, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash just as his hand brushed against it. He stumbled back, panic rising in his chest. The shadow seemed to be growing, expanding, filling the barn, with a darkness that pressed in on him from every direction. The whispering came again, louder. Now more insistent. "Leave, leave now." Jake's body moved without thinking. He backed away from the door, turning toward the far side of the barn. His eyes searched desperately for another way out, but there was nothing. No windows, no other doors, just the suffocating blackness closing in. And then through the darkness, he saw something else. A figure, tall and thin, with long, ragged arms that seemed to stretch out from the shadow reaching toward him. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move toward him. Its steps slow and deliberate. It didn't speak, but the air seemed to hum with its presence, a deep vibration that rattled his bones. His mind raced. The barn, the shadow, the figure. It was too much to understand, too much to process. He turned toward the door, again pushing against it with all his strength, but the barn didn't give way. It was as if the walls themselves were closing and forcing him to stay. The shadow reached for him, its fingers long and thin, like tendrils made of darkness. And as it brushed against his arm, a chill shot through him, colder than anything he had ever felt. With a final desperate push, Jake broke free, stumbling out of the barn into the night. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty field like a thunderclap. He didn't stop running until he was back at the farmhouse, his heart still pounding, his body trembling with fear. But the barn was still there, looming in the distance, silent now, as though nothing had ever happened. And in the back of his mind, the whisper lingered, soft but persistent. "You'll return." Jake lay in bed that night, the events of the barn swirling in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't shake. He kept his eyes closed, trying to will himself to sleep. But every time he drifted near the edge of unconsciousness, the memory of that shadow, the figure, pulled him back. The feeling of it was too real, too close. The whispering, the cold, the weight of the darkness, it all lingered, pressing in on him. From the corners of the room, the night was still save for the occasional rustle of wind against the window. He could almost feel the barn in his bones, its oppressive presence still watching from the distance. He wanted to leave. He wanted to escape it all and never return. But deep down, a cold dread gnawed at him. He knew he would have to go back. The pull of the barn was too strong, the unfinished business too pressing. The next morning, the sun rose cold and gray, as though even the sky had lost its warmth. Jake knew he couldn't stay inside forever. He had to face it. The barn, the shadow. He had to know what was really happening there. He pulled himself from bed and dressed quickly, trying to ignore the heavy knot in his stomach. As he walked across the field toward the barn, the same feeling of unease settled in. The wind had picked up, swirling around him like a warning. The barn stood there unchanged, just as it had the night before. Silent, looming. It seemed to hum with a low energy, as though it had been waiting for him. Jake stood outside the door for a long moment, gathering his courage. The whispers were still there, in the back of his mind, faint but persistent. Leave. He tried to ignore it, but his body felt heavy, like it was being dragged toward the darkness inside. The door creaked open, and the smell of hay and dust hit him immediately, just as it had the night before. He stepped inside the wooden floorboards, groaning under his weight, the shadows creeping along the walls. The barn was just as he remembered, dark, empty, and still. But this time, there was something different. The air was thick, oppressive, heavy with an unseen presence. Jake's eyes moved toward the far corner of the place where the shadow had been. His heart quickened as he saw it again. The same thick darkness pooling on the ground, stretching like a stain in the corner. His breath caught in his throat. It was as if it had been waiting for him to return. It was alive, breathing, with a slow, measured pulse moving slightly, as though it was shifting, adapting to his presence. And then he saw it, just like before the figure. Tall, thin, impossibly elongated, it stood just at the edge of the shadow, watching him. Its face was obscured, hidden in the deep folds of darkness, but Jake could feel its gaze. He could feel it drilling into him, its eyes pulling him into the depths. This time there was no whisper, no command, just silence. A deep, suffocating silence that made Jake's skin crawl. He stepped back instinctively, his heart racing. The barn felt colder now, the air thick with the weight of something ancient, something older than time. The figure moved, but it didn't walk. It floated. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its body bent at strange angles, twisting and warping as it advanced. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to run to turn and escape, but his legs refused to obey. It was as if the barn itself had a hold on him, locking him in place. The figure came closer, moving like smoke, its body ever shifting, ever changing. It seemed to take form, then dissolve again, its presence a distortion in the air. With every step the figure took, the barn seemed to grow darker, the shadows swallowing up the faint light from the outside. Jake could feel the darkness pressing against him, suffocating him, wrapping around him like a cloak. And then, just as the figure reached out toward him, a sound echoed through the barn, a low, guttural growl, deep and rumbling, as if the earth itself was responding. The sound came from the depths of the shadows, from beneath the floorboards. Jake looked down and saw the ground shift, like something beneath it was moving, something ancient, something buried. The growl grew louder, vibrating through the wooden walls, shaking the very foundation of the barn. The shadows seemed to ripple, as if the barn itself was alive, reacting to the figure that was now mere feet away from him. Jake couldn't breathe. He felt his chest tighten as the figure reached toward him, its fingers stretching out like claws, the air around him thickening. The growl from below grew louder, more insistent, like a warning. Something was about to break free. In a desperate rush of adrenaline, Jake broke free of the paralysis that had gripped him. He turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven floorboards as he made his way to the door. The barn seemed to close in on him, the walls narrowing, the shadows shifting. He could feel the figure behind him, its presence chasing him, reaching out. He reached for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang just as his hand touched the handle. Panic surged through him. He pushed against it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows were too thick now, suffocating, closing in around him. He turned, his heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't see the figure anymore. The air was too heavy, too thick. A sudden flash of light cut through the darkness. It was fleeting, like the last gasp of a dying flame, but it illuminated the barn long enough for Jake to see it. The figure was gone, but something else had taken its place. A dark, swirling mass growing larger, like a vortex sucking in everything around it. The growling from beneath the floor intensified, and Jake realized the ground was beginning to shake the barn, groaning as if it were coming apart at the seams. The walls cracked, the ceiling trembled. He had to get out. With a final frantic push, Jake forced the door open, tumbling out into the field, gasping for air. The barn stood behind him, silent now, its presence as foreboding as ever. He backed away, his body shaking with fear, his mind racing. The barn was still there. The shadow was still there. And it was waiting for him. "You'll return," the whispering echoed in his mind, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't over. The barn had claimed him, and it would never let him go. Story 5: The Cursed Field. The field stretched before Abigail, a patchwork of browns and greens that seemed to ripple under the weight of the wind. It wasn't much, a few acres of land her grandparents had farmed for decades, but it held memories both sweet and sour. As a child, she'd run through these very fields with her cousins, laughing and playing under the warmth of the sun. Now, in her adult years, it was hers to tend to keep alive in the way that only a farm could demand. It wasn't a field she had chosen. Abigail had inherited the land after her grandmother's passing, and it was with a sense of duty more than any excitement that she returned to it. The small house by the road needed repairs, and the land had long been abandoned, the soil hardened and cracked from years of neglect. But there was a strange pull, a deep-rooted sense of belonging that made it impossible to leave. The field was hers now, and it called to her, quietly, relentlessly. The first few weeks were uneventful. She cleared the land of weeds, repaired the broken fences, and plowed the soil, all under the watchful gaze of the farm's old barn, standing crooked at the edge of the field like a forgotten sentinel. Abigail wasn't one to believe in superstitions, but there was something about the barn that made her skin prickle when she got too close. It wasn't the barn itself, exactly, it was the field. The land had an odd quality. At first, she dismissed it as the solitude, the quiet of rural life getting to her. But there were moments in the late afternoon when the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far, and the wind carried whispers that weren't entirely natural. It didn't happen often, but when it did, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. A presence that lingered beneath the soil, something older than the land itself. One late afternoon, while walking along the edge of the field, Abigail stumbled upon something strange, an old half-buried stone marker in the ground. At first, she thought it might be the remnant of a long-forgotten fence post, or perhaps a broken piece of farming equipment. But as she knelt down to examine it, she realized it was something else entirely. The stone was smooth, weathered by time, but still legible, a series of marking symbols that looked almost like an old language, faded but still discernible. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as her fingers traced the rough surface. The strange symbols, though unfamiliar, seemed to pulse under her touch, a quiet hum that she could feel in her bones. She quickly pulled her hand away, feeling a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have been, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Abigail stood, shaking off the unsettling feeling, and turned to walk back to the house. But as she moved, she caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a shadow, a dark shape that appeared to be moving across the field. Her heart skipped a beat and she stopped in her tracks. She squinted into the fading light, but the shadow was gone, swallowed by the twilight. For a moment she wondered if it had been a trick of the light. But as she stood there, she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching her, waiting. The next day she returned to the spot, determined to find out more. But the stone marker was gone. The earth was undisturbed, as though it had never been there. Abigail's breath caught in her throat, a sense of unease settling deep in her stomach. She searched the ground for any sign of the marker, but there was nothing. The field was empty as it always had been. Days passed and life on the farm returned to its slow, steady rhythm. Abigail focused on her work, tending to the crops and the animals, but the nagging feeling of being watched never fully left. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, and each time she passed the spot where the marker had been, the ground seemed to pulse beneath her feet. It was as if the land itself was alive, watching her, waiting for something. It was on the 5th day after the stone had vanished that Abigail heard the first whisper. It came on the wind, faint but clear. At first, she thought it was the rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird, but then she heard it again, closer this time. She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a low hum, a wordless murmur that seemed to be carried by the wind. She turned around, scanning the empty field. Nothing. The air felt still again, as if the whisper had never been there at all. But the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She could feel it, the weight of something in the air pressing against her, urging her to listen, to understand. That night, after the sun had set and the sky turned a dark purple, Abigail lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that the land was calling her, beckoning her towards something she didn't fully understand. She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but the whispers were real. She couldn't deny it. As she lay there, her eyes finally closing in an attempt to sleep, she heard it again, a soft murmur rising from the depths of the earth. The whisper seemed to come from below, from deep in the ground, just beyond her reach. It was a single word this time, clear and unmistakable. Return. Abigail's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was silent. The only sound, the wind outside rustling through the trees, but the words still echoed in her mind. Return. What did it mean? What did the land want from her? The whispers continued the next day, growing louder and more insistent, filling her mind with questions she had no answers to. As the wind blew through the field, it carried the word on the breeze, as though the land itself was speaking to her, urging her to do something. Abigail knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. The field was cursed, and whatever lay beneath the soil, whatever had been buried for so long, was awakening, and it was calling to her. Abigail could no longer ignore the growing sense of unease that permeated the land. Every step she took in the field seemed to bring her closer to something ancient, something buried deep beneath the soil. The whispers had become impossible to ignore louder, now urging her to do something she couldn't fully comprehend. They were persistent, pulling at her thoughts like an unseen force, and she knew she couldn't fight it forever. The land had a hunger to it, a need that she couldn't quite understand, but it was undeniable. The field was calling her. That afternoon, Abigail went back to the spot where the marker had once been. The place felt different now, more oppressive, as though the earth itself was watching her, waiting for her to act. She dropped to her knees, feeling the dirt beneath her fingers as she dug carefully into the ground. Her breath quickened as she worked the soil, turning loose in her hands, the whispers growing louder in her mind. She didn't know what she was looking for, but something urged her forward, a deep, inexplicable pull that she couldn't resist. Minutes passed and then an hour, until the ground finally gave way with a soft thud. Abigail's hands trembled as she cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing something cold and hard, buried deep beneath the earth. It was a small box, weathered and worn with age, its edges chipped and cracked, as if it had been here for centuries. Her breath caught in her throat as she lifted the box, the weight of it unsettling. She could feel the air around her grow colder, the whispers louder, as if the land itself was anticipating her next move. She hesitated for a moment, then pried the box open. Inside, there was nothing but dust. Nothing but the faint, hollow remnants of whatever had once been stored here. But then from beneath the dust, something caught her eye. A small, weathered piece of parchment, fragile and yellowed with age. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, unfolding it carefully, as if afraid it might crumble in her hands. The writing on the paper was faint, the ink faded but still legible. She read the words aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "The land does not forget. Those who walk upon it will return bound by the earth's will." Her pulse quickened. The words sent a chill through her, a sense of dread rising from the pit of her stomach. The land does not forget. What did that mean? Was it referring to her? Was it speaking about the Millers? The family who had once lived here, the family who had vanished without a trace. Had they been drawn into this too? And if so, what did it mean for her? Abigail's mind raced, but before she could process anything further, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The soil seemed to tremble, a low, rumbling vibration coming from deep beneath the earth. She looked up, fear flooding through her as the air grew colder, still a biting chill that made her skin crawl. The whispering came again, louder this time, almost deafening. It was no longer just a murmur on the wind. It felt like the earth itself was speaking to her, urging her to listen, to understand. "Return, you're bound." The ground shifted again, and this time, Abigail stumbled back as something began to emerge from the soil. A figure, tall and shadowed, began to rise slowly from the earth, its form indistinct, shifting like smoke in the wind. Her heart raced. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure's shape seemed to blur and bend, its edges jagged, as if it was struggling to take form. She tried to back away, but her legs felt heavy, like they were anchored to the ground. The figure moved its form, becoming more solid, but still not entirely human. The shadows that clung to it seemed to ripple and shift, as if the figure itself was made of the very soil that surrounded her. Its face was hidden, obscured by the shifting darkness. But Abigail could feel its eyes. She could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, burning into her. "You must return what was taken." The voice echoed deep and hollow, like it was coming from the earth itself. The whisper was no longer just a distant murmur. It was clear, direct, insistent. Abigail opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating the air, thick with the scent of earth and decay. She felt the weight of something ancient pressing down on her. Something that had been waiting for a long time. The whispering grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. Return what was taken. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest as the figure reached out a long skeletal hand toward her. She could feel it, the heavy pull of the earth beneath her feet, as if the land itself was calling her, drawing her in. The figure's hand hovered just inches from her skin, the shadow of its touch sending a wave of cold through her body. She gasped, her body shaking as she stumbled backward, finally breaking free of the invisible grip that had held her in place. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth, her mind consumed with the sound of the whispering echoing in her ears. The wind picked up, howling in her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The land was closing in on her, the earth itself seeming to chase her, pulling at her every step. She reached the farmhouse, her breath ragged, and slammed the door shut behind her, the echoes of the whispering still lingering in the back of her mind. But even as the door closed, she could feel it, the land, the field, the thing beneath the soil. It was still there waiting. And in the distance, beyond the edge of the field, the figure was watching her, its dark shape fading into the shadows of the evening. Abigail knew then that she couldn't escape. The land would never let her go. It was calling her back, and no matter where she ran, it would find her again. The curse of the field had claimed her just as it had claimed those before her, and now she was bound to it forever.